decided that Mark would be the theme we unpack during this 40-day period as we prepare for that special festival of Easter, which is next month. I always have to get my head around starting with Mark, because I suppose it is easy to forget that Mark was written before the others. In our New Testament, Matthew opens the canon, and so we have to teach ourselves again and again that chronologically Mark came first. We're also really not supposed to underestimate the importance of Mark. We have some very early documents written by some of the church fathers that stress that Mark is important not only because it's the earliest, but also because it is, according to what we know, the first-hand account of Peter's preaching. In the early church, one of the big shots was a guy with the name of Papias, P-A-P-I-A-S. And in one of the 5 books that we have by him, based on the life of Jesus, he tells us that Mark was the recorder of Peter. So in my mind, I have this image of Mark sitting around while Peter was proclaiming the gospel, taking notes, not wanting to miss out on any of the action. And so if that report is true, I cannot emphasize how precious Mark is to us. As one of the early documents, the story of what Peter had to say as the apostles were starting to preach all over the place. Later, when Matthew wrote his gospel, maybe 6-7 years after Mark, he used Mark as one of these great sources to put his gospel together. And guess what? Later, when Luke decided to write his gospel, he also relied heavily not only on Matthew, but also on Mark, as he put his gospel together so comprehensively. It is thus almost impossible to overstress the significance that Mark has as the first gospel to be written in New Testament times. I have been teaching a little bit on the background of Mark, and today I want to look at one of the first accounts that he gives us, and that is the calling of the first disciples. We read his account of this in Mark chapter 1. So it's now common knowledge, I hope everybody knows, that Mark was writing during a crucial time in the early church. He was writing while Emperor Nero was killing Christians left, right, and center. And that is why Mark is known as the martyr gospel, because all over the place Mark was hearing of how believers were paying with their life for the sake of the gospel. Mark doesn't give us any birth narratives. There just wasn't time to include anything about how Jesus came into the world. He jumps right in because his writing is a matter of urgency. And it looks like poor Mark even had to end his gospel under quite a bit of pressure, because he was probably in the end persecuted as a Christian also. And so if Mark is badly structured, that's why. Mark writes in chapter 1, after having immediately started with John the Baptist and the baptism and temptation of Jesus, he wastes no time, and even in chapter 1 already, he includes Jesus calling his very first disciples. I read from verse 14. After John had been put in prison, as from verse 16, as Jesus walked along the shore of Lake Galilee, he saw 2 fishermen, Simon and his brother Andrew, catching fish with a net. Is there another version on the screen? Let me just read from the screen. He saw Simon and his brother Andrew casting a net into the lake, for they were fishermen. So they were doing what they did best, and that was to throw nets into the water. Come, follow me, Jesus said, and I will send you out to fish for people. At once they left their nets and followed him. When he had gone a little further, he saw James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John in a boat, preparing their nets, doing what they knew best. Without delay, he called them, and they left their father Zebedee in the boat with the hired men and followed him. This is a passage that has intrigued me for many years. It's so interesting how Jesus goes about putting his team together. What Jesus does here in this passage is quite controversial. Why? Because that's not normally how rabbis would do it. Rabbis would hang out in places like the temple and the synagogues, waiting for students to approach them, to come and basically beg them to be their teacher. Jesus turns this whole system upside down and says, I'm not going to find a place where I can look all important, waiting for people to approach me to be my disciples. I'm going to go out into the highways and byways of the towns and the cities, and I'm going to find myself a group that I can work with. And surprise of surprises, Jesus ends up not going to the religious institutions where the learned and the impressive would have been hanging out. Jesus goes to the lowly and to the humble in society. There was no way that these fishermen would have often been at worship. There's also no way that they would have had any kind of even basic education. Their daily lives were all about survival, putting food on the table, supplying the needs of their wives and children. And so Jesus does this very unorthodox thing, saying, I'm going to find myself people who are teachable. Not people who would not listen to what I say, or wouldn't care less about this new kingdom that I'm trying to introduce. I'm going to find myself some humble and lowly guys. Guys that are flexible in their approach to faith. Guys who would be excited and open to this new message that I am beckoning in. I'm always fascinated by how these guys, minding their own business, immediately are willing to go after Jesus. Either there was something irresistible in his voice, or they had heard of him by the time he took his stroll on the beachfront. Both the first set and the second set in this passage today, it is said of them that immediately they left their nets behind. At once they followed him. I have a suspicion that they had heard of this non-traditional rabbi doing his rounds, and perhaps word on the street had already got out that he was teaching some new truths, that his approach to theology was fresh and different. And maybe they just couldn't say no to checking that out for themselves. I feel quite sorry for their dad, Zebedee, who had to tweak the family business after his sons just upped and left so abruptly. And in my mind's eye, I always have this picture of the boat having said Zebedee and Sons, and how poor dad Zebedee had to paint over the and sons bit, for it was no longer a family business. Jesus starts getting ready for something big and special and one of a kind, putting a team together who would follow him even to the bitter end. What is there for me to say this morning on the theme of discipleship. I must probably start at the beginning. And that is with us clarifying what the word disciple means. Over the years, I have found it quite funny how I try to let people know the meaning of the word, and how we often, myself included, retract to what the meaning of disciple is. For almost automatically, we want to say that the synonym for disciple is follower. And that's not entirely true. Of course, being a disciple of Jesus means that you try and follow him with all your heart and with all your strength every day. But the word disciple in its original form means learner. And there's a lesson in that, dare I say. First and foremost, if we talk about being disciples of Jesus, what we should mean is that we are learners of Jesus. And that we are putting in the work, whatever it takes, to learn from him with every step that we take. There's a heck of a lot that we must learn from Jesus. Like loving our neighbor, for instance. And then, of course, loving ourselves. There's a lot that we need to learn from Jesus, like how to care for the poor. And then in the same step, how to also challenge the oppressive systems that made the poor in the first place. There's a lot that we need to learn from Jesus, like how to be faithful in prayer, for instance. We need to learn from Jesus how to live a life which glorifies God, a life of obedience and faith. Not only do we need to learn from Jesus how to live, we also need to learn from Jesus how to die. For on the cross of Calvary, in total and complete surrender, Jesus teaches us how to die. In other words, with our trust firmly placed in God. Who can ever forget that loaded prayer Jesus prays from the cross as he breathes his last? Father, into thy hands I commit my spirit. So even when Jesus was getting ready to close his eyes one final time, he teaches the onlooker how to die. Jesus teaches us how to deal with doubt, how to deal with uncertainty, even how to deal with fear. For in the Garden of Gethsemane, in that shadowy place, Jesus came face to face with his own struggles. And so I'm sure that you will all agree with me that when it comes to learning, there's a lot that Jesus can teach us. The discipleship journey is a journey of learning, not necessarily of arrival. You know, some people come to faith, they give their hearts to Jesus, they become converted or born again, whatever phrase you want to use, and then there is a sense of having arrived that settles in. And that is just not the Jesus way. Where people think, gosh, I am now forgiven, I'm on my way to heaven, that settles the matter. Forgetting that there's a whole walk of growth and spiritual formation that needs to unfold from that moment. The best example I can use is probably the example of my ordination 15 years ago. For of course there are many church traditions who make a big fuss of ordination, and I will never downplay the importance of being an ordained clergy person. For those vows I made on the 26th of September 2010 live within me. Those vows never leave me. They are with me day and night. But let me explain what I mean. So, after the calling came to me in 1997 when I was in Standard 8, I had then already started the preparation to that one fateful day where the ordination ceremony would take place. And after I candidated myself for the ministry, this process started unfolding. And so for 8 years, there was gruesome training by the Methodist Church. It was the most harrowing thing that had ever happened to me. The amount of exams that I had to go through, the amount of committees that I had to appear in front of, the amount of research and studying that I had to do were just next level. And so eventually I came to my ordination year. And the ordination service itself was preceded by a 7-day silent retreat, just to make sure that this is what we still wanted to do, and whether God and I were still on the same page about me being in full-time ministry. And so there was the ordination service. The church had to rent a warehouse in East London because there wasn't a church big enough to cater for the ordination of 50 probationers. A congregation of more than 5,000 people gathered in celebration and affirmation. And I thought that once ordained, the world would be right. I thought that after being ordained, the work would stop and the effort would diminish. How wrong I was to have thought of ordination as a place of arrival. The shock and the horror reached me the following day as I got up for the first time as an ordained person. And then I realized that ordination was an important step, but it was just the beginning of a very long walk, of further growth, of further formation, of further steps being pruned and shaped to become more like Jesus. How disappointed I was on that morning, when that awakening came to me that there's more work to be done, that I have to try harder instead of less hard to keep my relationship with Jesus personal and intimate. I don't want any of you to find yourselves in that dangerous place where you have now made that commitment, where you've given your life to Jesus and where you think that is it. For that would be a wrong approach. That, although it is a vital step, that's only the first step. Discipleship continues as an adventurous journey of learning about Jesus, learning of Jesus, from Jesus, learning who He is and who He has called you to be as His disciple. I have often found being His disciple very difficult. Of course, there are the happy moments when it comes naturally. But there are also those moments when being a disciple of Jesus is very, very, very daunting. Where one has to make kingdom decisions. Where you have to make a decision whether you're going to forgive that person or not. Whether you're going to share your resources with the poor or not. Whether you're going to deny yourself or not. Because Jesus is very clear on what He says on all of that stuff. And so I have been tweaking my approach to this whole discipleship a little bit. Are people still listening? It's awfully quiet out there. Normally at least snort or something so that I know you're alive. But anyway, this nervous chuckle will do it for now. Okay, so what do I do now to make discipleship a little bit easier? Are you wanting to hear my idea or not? Okay, I'll tell you. Every morning, I do something now that just kind of puts me on the right track. So every morning when I have my daily devotion, I now ask a question of Jesus. I now say to Jesus, instead of overwhelming me with lots of stuff that I must learn in the next 24 hours, I say to Jesus, what would you like me to learn from you today? Are you going to teach me a little bit about patience? A little bit on tolerance? A little bit on generosity? What is your plan when it comes to teaching me one of your kingdom values today? And so I don't feel overly challenged. To me it now comes in manageable bits, if you know what I mean. Something that I can cope with. The second thing I now ask of Jesus every morning is to help me with whatever situation I will be finding myself with in that work day. For sometimes we find ourselves in tough situations. And sometimes the situation is so tough one can't make up your mind what you will do then and there. So early on, even as the sun rises, I now meet with Jesus and I say to him, please, let me learn from you in whatever situation I find myself. So if I find myself in a situation of loss, perhaps a dear one dies, how do I grieve in a way that is pleasing to you? When I find myself in a situation that angers me, and believe it or not, sometimes even I get angry, then I turn to Jesus and say, help me in this situation to learn from you. How would you deal with this sticky issue? And sometimes I succeed, and sometimes I don't. But the desire is there to whether I feel happy or sad, whether I feel at peace or angry, to make decisions informed by Jesus. I don't think that there's any other way which is a worthwhile way of living except the Jesus way. We have to live what we learn from Jesus. Otherwise, what's the point? Anybody can say that Jesus is my role model, Jesus is my master and my guide, and I look at him for mentorship. But if we don't implement that in our actions every day, then this world is never going to be transformed. For anybody can pay lip service and say, I'm a disciple of Jesus. The question is, are we his disciples or are we not? Are we willing to take what we learn from him and put it into practice in our daily lives? It's the easiest thing out to talk the walk, but can we walk the talk? In John chapter 14, Jesus says very clearly that those who love me will do what I say. And this is a verse that has disturbed me quite badly in the last week, and so I don't want to suffer alone. I'm giving it to you to ponder on. In John chapter 14, Jesus says, if you love me, you will obey my commandments. In John chapter 15, just a few verses on, Jesus speaks to his disciples and Jesus says, by your fruit you will be known. John 15, verse 8. Jesus was getting his disciples ready at that time for the crucifixion. So Jesus had to take whatever he said to them very seriously because he was running out of time. So what Jesus chooses to say to them in John chapters 14 and 15 really matters. And so Jesus thought it very important for them to know that if they loved him, it would show. That if they were serious about learning from him, there would be fruit to The second thing I want to say on discipleship, only if people are willing to listen, I don't want to be one of those preachers. So, can I go to my second point, or have you had enough for today? Second point. Okay. The first point is discipleship is about learning. Secondly, discipleship is about being sent. We cannot ignore this intention of Jesus. When Jesus calls to himself a group of 12 guys to begin with, when Jesus gathers them around him, it is not just for the sake of. It is not just Jesus saying, I need a couple of friends, I've been feeling rather lonely, let me start a bird watching club. Or let me start a bowling team. Jesus had a very specific dream in mind, and that was he needed a group of people who would be partners with him in changing the face of the earth. And so Jesus didn't just do it because it was the thing to do. There was a plan in place and a heavenly purpose. So Jesus says to them, come guys. Jesus finds the fishermen. Jesus finds Matthew, who had been a tax collector, a couple of others, and Jesus says to them, okay, we need to talk. In Mark chapter 3, we have the heading of one of those passages where it says, the appointment of the 12. And this is something that I had overlooked many times before. I just thought that the heading there would be the calling of the 12, or at least the sending out of the 12. And it doesn't say that in Mark chapter 3. It says the appointment of the 12. The sending out of that group happens 3 chapters on in Mark 6. So this looks like it was Jesus' strategy. He begins by gathering them from the highways and byways of the cities and towns. He's not looking for the learned and the qualified or the very holy and the studiously religious. He starts with the simple, with fishermen. Once he had them around him, he said, okay guys, you better learn from me as fast as you possibly can. And then 3 chapters on, and we don't know exactly the time span between those 2 chapters, but let's just say when the time was right, Jesus sent them out in Mark chapter 6. 2 by 2, so that there could be a bit of moral support sort of thing. So we have the calling, Jesus drawing them near, teaching and training them, and then sending them out. For that was, dear friends, the point. In John chapter 17, Jesus prays an exquisite prayer. Days before his death. Jesus calls out to God and he prays for his followers, he prays for the church, he prays for the world. And one of the things that Jesus includes so beautifully in that prayer, John chapter 17, is this, where Jesus makes reference to his disciples and says to God the Father, just as you have sent me, so I'm sending them into the world. Please be with them. And then the ultimate comes in John chapter 20. It's one of the post-resurrection passages where Jesus appears to his disciples on the night of the resurrection. So he gets out of the grave, the morning, the stone is rolled away, Jesus lives again, and that evening the disciples were still in hiding. Remember? John chapter 20. They were in a locked room, the author tells us, hiding for fear of the Jews, thinking that they would also be crucified. Jesus appears to them in his risen presence and power, and Jesus gives them peace, and Jesus shows them his hands and his feet where the nail marks were, and then Jesus says to them, John 20 verse 21, then Jesus says to them, just as the Father sent me, so I am sending you. if there's ever a passage that cannot be mistaken, a passage that cannot possibly be misunderstood, it's probably that. We can't mishear what Jesus means in these very clear words. Just as the Father sent me, so I am now sending you. I have often had a problem with being sent. I didn't have a choice. Of course, having been sent to Hermanus was a different ball game altogether. I'm so happy here, and I love you, and I love this town. It's a win-win. But sometimes we get sent to unpleasant places. Sometimes we get sent to unpleasant people. Sometimes we get sent to places we wouldn't want to go near with a 10-foot pole. Jesus did have this awkward expectation of his disciples. Jesus says to them, go to your very own first, to the lost house of Israel. I can just imagine how worked up the disciples must have been at first, and how they just wanted to run as fast as their legs could carry them all over the place, finding people from the streets, finding people from the pavements, finding people on the sport fields to evangelize. But Jesus said to them, you know what? Don't forget your own. And there's a challenge there for me. For sometimes we neglect our own to take the gospel somewhere else. What do we do with Peter having to go to his mother-in-law's house because she's sick? This is a story included in all the synoptics. We find it in Mark, Matthew, and Luke. Right early on, before things got hectic, what is the first stop that Jesus made with his new disciples? Jesus was taken with Peter to the house of his mother-in-law. Now, I've never been married. I don't know what it is to have a mother-in-law, but I have a hunch that things can get very tricky when there's a mother-in-law involved. You know what I'm saying? And I wonder if there's not something for us to notice here. If there's not something about Peter, who wanted to now bring the whole world to Jesus, Peter having to start where it matters most. I'm wondering if that wasn't Jesus' way of saying to Peter, charity begins at home. And sometimes the most difficult thing that we are called to do, the most daunting place we are sent to, is our very own family. Our very own homes. I sometimes wonder if I should go to those in my family who don't know Christ. I don't want to be a buzzkill at a family party or celebration, but can I really stand here and preach to the faithful Sunday after Sunday after Sunday while there are people in my clan who are not yet following Jesus? It just doesn't sit right with me. You see, it's easy to preach here in church, for we're all on the same side. Sometimes we get sent to very uncomfortable and inconvenient places. And we must ask the Holy Spirit for wisdom, for courage to minister in those contexts. Being sent is a challenging thing. Jesus sent his disciples into Samaria. If we learn about the history of the Jews and the Samaritans, we will know why that was so inexplicably controversial. the last place that any average Jew wanted to be found in would have been on Samaritan soil. And Jesus says, guys, you're going to have to get over this hatred. You're going to have to get over this animosity. You're going to have to work through this bitterness. You're going to have to work through this resentment. I'm sending you to take my name into there where the arch enemy lives. I remember once in a sermon illustrating to you in front here to what extent the hatred reigned between the Jews and the Samaritans. Remember, Galilee was in the north and Jerusalem was in the south. And for festivals, people, Jews from the north, would have to travel down to the south to get to the temple in Jerusalem. In between the two areas, there was what? Samaria. Now, this is something that I just cannot get over. Jews traveling from the north down to the south would absolutely refuse to set foot on Samaritan soil. So somewhere here, quite close to home, they would cross the Jordan River, move down on this side, evading and avoiding Samaria, and eventually get to the point where Jericho is close, then cross the river again, and so eventually get to Jerusalem. It was a much longer trip. It was a much more dangerous road, but they didn't care about that. All they cared about was not running into a Samaritan. So Jesus says, I'm sorry about what it's going to cost you, but this is how it's going to be. For if you don't go to them, who will tell those we don't like about Jesus if we don't? Jesus gives us that fetching parable in Luke chapter 10, the story of the Good Samaritan, which of course broke down a whole lot of comfort zones. Being sent is not as romantic as it sounds. Poor Paul quickly discovered that. After his Damascus Road experience in Acts chapter 9, God said to him categorically, you will be the apostle to the Gentiles. In other words, those who know nothing about the Jewish faith. Those who want nothing to do with religion. Paul 3 times in his letters, in Galatians, in Ephesians, and in Romans, refers to himself as the apostle to the Gentiles. Not because that is what he would have chosen, I'm sure, but because that is what his calling ended up being. He was sent to those who were totally and utterly different to him. Many of the Gentiles would have been pagans, so they wouldn't have had any kind of religious foundation. There was no faith background. So can you imagine how challenging that must have been for poor Paul? And yet he did it, for he knew that he would never be happy if he disobeyed the calling that God had placed on his life. Being sent at first sight can sound like something quite thrilling, you know. God sent me here. God sent me to Hermanus. God sent me there. But it seldom comes without the price to pay and the sacrifice to be given. Discipleship, however, if that's what we want to be and where we want to go, if we want to be disciples of Jesus, it's going to involve being sent by the Lord. In the 4 Gospels, the disciples are spoken of as disciples. What does the word disciple mean? Learner. In the rest of the New Testament, they aren't spoken of as disciples. I think the word disciple only occurs twice after John's Gospel. In the rest of the New Testament, what are they known as? Apostles. And what is the root word for apostles? The Greek apostolos, which means being sent out with a specific message. So you and I need to think. We need to think very deeply about this matter of how we are called to be disciples, but also apostles. The last thing that I want to comment on when it comes to this whole thing of discipleship. It looks like it's part of a disciple's job to make other disciples. You hear me? This is what Jesus says in the Great Commission as Matthew's Gospel comes to an end. We read it in chapter 28, verse 19, where Jesus says, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Go therefore and make what of all nations? Church people of all nations. Eh? Christians of all nations. Disciples of all nations. In other words, it's the job of those who are learning from Jesus to get other people to also learn from Him. So, I sometimes refer to the Great Commission as the Great Omission. For many a time we put this happily on the back burner, not wanting to come face to face with it. That it is our job, our responsibility, our greatest privilege to convince other people that Jesus is the way to go. That Jesus is the truth to know. And that Jesus is the life to live. Disciples need to disciple others. We learn from Jesus to convince other people that He is the only one worthwhile learning from. Those 3 points in for today. I've got lots more to say, but I'm trying to honor our commitment sort of thing for 10 past 11. So, let's recap. Discipleship is about learning. It's about being sent. It's about making other disciples. Years ago, I acquired my driver's license. My gentle mother taught me how to drive a car in our old Toyota Corolla, the early 2000s. And we had accompanying music to calm me down as I was learning how to change gears. The old Cliff Richard cassette, can you remember that? So I actually learned how to change gears to his Congratulations. It's not the most comforting song, but anyway. And I remember how when I was ready, I went for my learner's license. And then of course I got hold of an instructor who taught me on the course how to do the reverse parking, how to do the three-point turn, etc., etc. And of course my nerves were often shocked and I thought I would never ever get it right. And my instructor's name was Juliana, and she would teach me how to do reverse parking, how to turn the wheel at a 45-degree angle, and then how to check my blind spot, and then how to use the clutch and the petrol to kind of balance the car, and how I would actually get in, not before knocking down 3 of those plastic poles, of course. And when I eventually felt that I was into the parking with floods of perspiration coming down my face, she would be outside the car, probably just as well. She would be outside the car and I would shout out the window, "A second! A second!" And she, with a sigh of relief, would say, "Yes, but only just." I suppose in many ways we are all still learner drivers, learning daily how best to be a disciple of Jesus, figuring it out how we can follow Him without ever wanting to turn around. Sometimes I want to have a big piece of cardboard in the shape of a red L cut out and paste it on my back, walking around like an endangered species, making it clear to one and all that even now, I'm only a learner.